The dense fog clung to the mountain as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the silent whisper of wind through the pines. Rocky, a seasoned mountain rescue dog, stood at the edge of the forest, his ears perked, nostrils flaring as he searched the shifting winds. His handler, a middle-aged woman named Clara, stood behind him, steady but anxious. The team had been called out when a hiker, a young man named Daniel, had gone missing on the trail. The late afternoon search had become a race against the setting sun, and Rocky was their last hope. Rocky's dark, powerful legs rippled with muscle as he took his first few steps into the wild terrain, his paws sinking slightly into the damp earth. He moved with precision, his movements fluid and sure, yet there was something in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The forest felt alive, not in a way that was comforting, but in a way that made his instincts sharpen. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Birds had ceased their calls, and even the rustling leaves had fallen quiet. Clara, accustomed to the silence of the wilderness, scanned the ground for any sign of Daniel, but nothing. The trail was faint. There were no fresh footprints, no clear signs of direction. The only thing that remained were the lingering echoes of Daniel's voice, the sound of his distant panic, and the haunting call of a coyote in the far distance. Rocky sniffed the ground, his nose working furiously, pulling at the scents that had been left behind. The wind shifted and he tugged his handler forward, deeper into the forest. Clara followed, her heart racing as she tried to focus on the task ahead. The temperature was dropping quickly, and the fog was thickening. Every step seemed to lead them further into the unknown, where the trees grew denser, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. The forest, once welcoming, felt oppressive. As they trekked through the increasingly dense brush, Clara's thoughts began to race. They had been out here for hours. Daniel was young, but he wasn't experienced. The wilderness could be unforgiving to those unprepared. She checked her watch. 6:45 p.m. She estimated that they had about an hour before nightfall. If they didn't find him soon, they would have to call off the search for the night. Suddenly, Rocky stopped. His body stiffened, and his ears flicked back as he sniffed the air. Clara froze beside him, eyes scanning the forest, but she saw nothing unusual. Rocky's tail remained low, alert. The usual sounds of the forest, wind through trees, the occasional chirp of a bird, seemed muted now, as if the world was waiting. There was something in the air, something that made the forest feel as if it was holding a secret. The silence was broken by a faint sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible. A rustling in the underbrush followed by a thud, like something heavy shifting among the trees. Rocky's eyes narrowed as he lifted his snout, pulling Clara gently toward the sound. They pushed through the dense thicket, and there it was. A faint trace of Daniel's backpack, caught in the thorns, torn and abandoned. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Daniel been attacked? Was he hurt? Then Rocky moved forward, his steps becoming deliberate, almost cautious. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she followed. The air seemed to grow colder, the fog thicker, and the shadows darker. They moved deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so close together that it felt like walking through a tunnel. The path was barely visible, and the forest felt like it was closing in on them. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw it. A figure, barely distinguishable in the mist. A man, crouched down in the underbrush, his back to them. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Had they found him? She motioned for Rocky to stay silent as she approached. As she drew closer, something didn't feel right. The figure wasn't moving. There was no sound, no sign of breath. Clara's pulse quickened and she reached out, gently touching the man's shoulder. The figure collapsed with a sickening thud, revealing that it was not Daniel at all. The realization hit like a wave. This wasn't Daniel. This was something else, someone else entirely. A body. The man's face was twisted in terror, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. A low, guttural growl rose from the distance, echoing through the trees. Clara froze. That sound wasn't a coyote. It was too close, too menacing. Rocky's hackles were raised, his body trembling with a deep primal tension. The growl came again, closer this time, and it was followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. Clara could feel the temperature drop, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. They were not alone. The forest had come alive, but not with the usual chatter of wildlife. This was something darker, something predatory. Clara's heart raced as she scanned the trees, but the fog was so thick she could barely see a few feet in front of her. Rocky, with his senses honed by years of training, stayed still, his body tense. The growl came again, this time followed by the unmistakable sound of snapping branches. It was huge, something larger than anything Clara had ever heard in these woods. Then, out of nowhere, a figure broke through the fog. A shadow, tall and menacing, with eyes that gleamed red in the dim light. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized it wasn't a wild animal at all. It was a man, but his face was twisted in some unnatural way. His eyes glinted with a feral madness, and his movements were erratic, almost animalistic. Echoes cracked, shouts. Clara stumbled back, but Rocky was already moving, circling her protectively. His low growl rumbled in his chest, warning the figure away. The man, or whatever he was, lunged forward, and Clara instinctively stepped back. Rocky sprang forward with a terrifying speed, barking fiercely, forcing the figure to halt. The man hesitated, as if weighing his next move. His eyes locked with Clara's, and she could see the faint traces of fear in them. He wasn't looking for a fight, not with Rocky in the way, but something about the encounter felt wrong. Clara's pulse was racing. Was this the missing hiker? Had he gone mad from the wilderness? Or was something else at play here? The man turned and vanished back into the fog, retreating into the shadows of the forest. Clara stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch her breath, her thoughts swirling. Was this Daniel? Or was it someone else who had become lost in these woods? A victim of something far worse than just the terrain? Rocky sniffed the ground, his keen senses leading him back toward a familiar path. Clara hesitated, her instincts torn between fear and duty. The forest around them was shifting, the sense of danger still lingering in the air. But they couldn't stop now. They had to find Daniel. The night was closing in, and the fog grew thicker, but Clara and Rocky pressed on, driven by something deeper than fear, a need to find the truth of what had happened to the missing hiker. They moved forward, knowing that every step could bring them closer to the answers they so desperately sought, or closer to something far more sinister, lurking just beyond the mist. As they ventured deeper into the fog-enshrouded forest, Clara's thoughts swirled like the mist that clung to the trees. Her mind raced through the possibilities, but nothing seemed to fit. Was Daniel the man she'd just encountered? Had he lost his sanity, his connection to reality in these woods? Or was there something more to this strange encounter? A darker force at play, something that wasn't just the isolation of nature, but something far more unsettling? Rocky led the way, his pace steady but cautious. He sniffed the air, occasionally pausing to scent the ground, as though he too could sense that the environment had shifted, that the natural order had been disturbed. The deeper they went, the more Clara felt the silence around them. A thick, suffocating quiet that was broken only by the sound of her boots crunching on the damp earth and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was a silence that spoke volumes, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trail had become nearly impossible to follow. The fog thickened with every passing minute, wrapping itself around the trees like a cold, wet blanket. Clara's mind wandered back to the backpack they'd found earlier. It had been torn, abandoned. Had Daniel left it intentionally, or had something forced him to run, to flee into the unknown? Was he still alive out here, somewhere. A sudden movement caught Clara's attention. A flicker of something in the periphery, a shadow darting between the trees. She froze, instinctively grabbing hold of Rocky's harness. The dog stood still, his body taut with tension, his ears swiveling, eyes searching the fog. The figure was gone before Clara could focus on it. But something lingered in the air. A presence. The kind of presence that doesn't belong. Rocky's nose twitched, and he gave a low, warning growl that made Clara's blood run cold. She strained her ears, trying to hear what he had. The wind had died completely, and the forest seemed to hold a heavy, unnatural stillness. And then, in the distance, Clara heard something. A sound she couldn't immediately place. It was soft at first, a low murmur that became louder. Then a shrill whimpering, followed by a rasping breath. It was human. Clara's heart leapt in her chest as she motioned for Rocky to follow. She began to move faster, adrenaline surging through her, propelling her forward as her thoughts raced. This sound was coming from a few 100 feet ahead, somewhere beyond the fog. Was it Daniel? Or was it something, or someone else trying to lure them in? The fog pressed in on them, making it harder to see anything more than a few feet ahead. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. It didn't make sense. Every part of her knew this wasn't just an ordinary search and rescue mission. There was something wrong here, something twisting the very air around them. The whimpering grew louder, more frantic. Clara could see a faint glow ahead, dim, eerie, and unnatural. It was the unmistakable orange of a flashlight, bouncing erratically as though the person holding it were struggling to keep it steady. She knew they were close now. Rocky's eyes were locked on the direction of the light, and his growl had become a constant hum in his chest. They finally broke through a cluster of dense shrubs and entered a small clearing. The sight that greeted Clara was almost too much to comprehend. In the middle of the clearing sat a man, disheveled, wild-made, and trembling. His clothes were torn, his hands clutching a flashlight, though it had fallen from his grip, casting strange, flickering shadows across the ground. But what chilled Clara to the bone was the deep, unnatural wound on the man's arm. It was jagged, the skin shredded in a way that couldn't have been caused by a simple fall or accident. The man's eyes locked onto hers, a hollow look in them. His lips moved, but no words came. Instead, there was a strange, guttural sound, a croak that made Clara's skin crawl. The man's body trembled as though he were in the throes of fever, but his eyes, those wide, fearful eyes, never left her. Clara took a step forward, instinct telling her to approach slowly. Something about the man's posture, his broken form, suggested he wasn't dangerous, but that feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Rocky was tense beside her, but his growls had softened into quiet whines. He, too, seemed uncertain. She reached out to check the man's pulse. It was faint but there, and his breathing was shallow. The wound on his arm was more than just a bite or a scratch. It was something far more severe. Clara looked around, trying to gather her bearings. Had something attacked him? Had he wandered too far from the trail? Or was he the victim of a predator? She didn't know, but the gnawing feeling in her gut was only growing stronger. Suddenly, the man's gaze shifted from Clara to something behind her. His eyes widened, terror flooding his expression. He tried to say something, but the sound was lost to the wind, a half-formed whisper. And then she heard it. A low growl, deep and reverberating through the fog. It wasn't from Rocky. Clara whipped around, her heart skipping a beat. A shape moved in the dense underbrush, its form massive and ominous. The growl came again, followed by the unmistakable crunch of heavy footsteps on the forest floor. It wasn't a bear. No, this was something different, something unnatural, something that belonged to the shadows of the forest. The ground seemed to tremble as the shape moved closer, the rustling growing louder. Rocky stepped protectively in front of Clara, his hackles raised, his body taut with energy. Clara backed up slowly, keeping her eyes on the shadows. The fog was thickening again, swirling around them, making it impossible to see clearly. The growl came again, closer now. Clara could hear it behind the fog, but she couldn't pinpoint its source. She reached for her radio, her fingers trembling as she tried to make contact with the base. But the static drowned her attempts. The creature emerged from the mist, a hulking figure, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. Its body was covered in matted fur, but its movements were too calculated, too deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for them. Clara's heart raced as she pulled Rocky closer, her instincts telling her to run, to get out of this clearing and back into the safety of the forest's heart. But something held her there. The fear in the man's eyes, the way he stared at the approaching creature, told Clara everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a random attack. The forest was hiding something ancient and dark. With a final, thunderous growl, the creature lunged, and the fog swallowed them all. The world seemed to implode in a blur of movement and sound. Rocky barked, his growl sharp and fierce, but it was drowned out by the thunderous crash of the creature's massive body pushing through the underbrush. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively reached for Rocky's harness, pulling him close. Feeling the tremors of his muscles beneath her hands. The creature, its eyes now glowing a menacing red, was upon them in an instant. Clara could see it clearly now, its hulking figure towering above her, its eyes wide with a primal hunger. The fur that covered its body was thick and matted, but it was the unnatural, unsettling quality of its presence that made Clara's breath catch. This was no wild animal. It wasn't even an animal at all. It was as if the very forest had birthed this creature. A manifestation of darkness, an ancient force awakened from the depths of the wilderness. A protector, perhaps, or a predator of a different sort. Clara's mind raced as she glanced around, searching for some escape, some way to fight back. The man she had found in the clearing was still there, his body trembling in terror, unable to move. His eyes remained locked on the creature, his gaze one of pure desperation. And then, in that brief moment of hesitation, Clara's instincts kicked in. With a sharp tug on Rocky's harness, she urged him forward, running toward the man. The creature hesitated, its massive form looming in place, watching them. It growled low, a sound so deep it reverberated in the pit of her stomach, as if the ground itself was rumbling with its presence. Clara reached the man, pulling him up with surprising strength, despite the shock that had rendered him almost immobile. His breath was shallow, his eyes wild, but there was still life in him. The creature growled again, but this time it was a sound of warning, not a threat. It knew they were close, too close to the edge of its territory. With Rocky leading the way, Clara sprinted through the clearing, pulling the man behind her. She could hear the creature's movements in the fog just behind them, its massive form gliding through the dense underbrush, its presence as constant as the ground beneath her feet. Every few moments Clara glanced over her shoulder, but all she could see were flashes of glowing eyes and dark shadows. The trees seemed to part before them, and Clara's heart quickened. She wasn't sure if it was the adrenaline or something more that guided her steps, but she could feel it. There was something guiding them, as if the forest itself were opening a path, offering them a way out. The fog was beginning to lift, and through the haze, Clara saw a break in the trees. A clearing where the ground sloped downward toward a fast-moving stream. If she could make it there, they might have a chance. The water would throw off the creature's scent, drown out its pursuit. But as they neared the edge of the clearing, the sound of rushing water seemed to fade. A new noise filled the air. Low, almost melodic, yet eerily unsettling. It wasn't the sound of wind, nor birds, nor any natural sound. It was the murmur of something older, something ancient. An inhuman song that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath her feet. The creature was close again, its growls now mixed with something else, a guttural sound that vibrated in her chest. Clara's legs burned, but she didn't stop. Rocky was ahead of her, bounding over rocks and roots, his eyes scanning the trees. The man was still gripping her arm, his strength faltering, but Clara held him steady. He was still alive, still breathing. That was all that mattered now.